It was the kind of silence that pressed against the chest, a stillness so heavy that even the crickets along the Tennessee field seemed reluctant to break it. On October nights of 1920, locals claimed to feel something different in the air, uncertain, watchful, like eyes studying them from just beyond the edge of the woods. The Caldwell family lived right on that invisible border, where farmsteads faded into thick groves of hickory and oak. The Caldwells were no different from any other hard-working family of the region. Henry Caldwell, a man of stern resolve, farmed the land his father had cleared decades earlier. His wife, Margaret, devoted her life to maintaining the house and raising their 3 children, Eleanor, the eldest at 12, her brother James, 9, and little Sarah, only 6 years old. To the neighbors, they represented everything ordinary, steady, and dependable. That was precisely why no one could comprehend the bizarre accounts that spilled into town in the weeks before their disappearance. Witnesses recalled seeing strangers walking the rural roads near the Caldwell property at odd hours of the night. Not drifters, not peddlers, but visitors who seemed out of place. Their clothing was described as too neat for laborers, but too worn for gentlemen. Their movements, deliberate and unsettling, carried the eeriness of people who had no destination and yet knew exactly where they were going. One farmer swore he saw 2 of them standing at the edge of his cornfield, unmoving, as if measuring the land with their eyes. Another told of hearing quiet voices on the road after midnight, laughter that stopped the moment he stepped onto his porch. These accounts circulated with unease, whispered across the general store's counters, and murmured in the pews of the town church. Yet no one dared to confront the strangers directly. On the evening of October 14th, the Caldwells themselves told a neighbor of unusual happenings. Henry mentioned to a man named Marcus Webb that his children woke terrified at night, claiming to see a pair of figures lingering near the trees. When Henry rushed out with a lantern, there was nothing but shadows. Margaret, her hands trembling as she recounted it, described finding unfamiliar footprints pressed into the mud by their well. Too large for the children, too slender to belong to Henry himself. She had scrubbed her hands raw washing the linens that same day, disturbed by the memory of hearing footsteps circling the house in the dark hours of morning. And yet, despite all these warnings, life went on. Henry refused to let fear dictate his family's days. The fields still needed tending. The animals still needed feeding. And children, no matter the dread surrounding them, still found ways to play. But the truth, as witnesses recalled later, was that the Caldwells were already living under a shadow. The strange visitors had been there, and they were watching. Over the coming days, reports of odd sightings grew more detailed. A traveling salesman claimed that while heading out of town, down a dirt road that would take him past the Caldwell farm, 2 figures emerged from the woods just ahead. He remembered the way their faces caught the moonlight, pale, sharp, and oddly still. He pulled his wagon to a stop, intending to offer a ride or a word of caution. It was dangerous to walk alone in that stretch at night. But in the brief moment it took him to lean forward and call out, the figures had vanished. The horses spooked, and the salesman swore they bolted nearly half a mile before he regained control. Neighbors remained uncertain. Was this hysteria taking root in the community? Or was there truly something strange happening near the Caldwell home? Much of Tennessee in 1920 still carried the weight of superstition, mixed in with the growing modernity of a nation stepping into a new decade. Farmers trusted their instincts. They knew the smell of rain before clouds gathered. They knew the cracks of woods where coyotes prowled at night. And when they whispered that something unnatural moved in the dark, the unease spread quickly. By the last week of October, even the sheriff heard talk of the strangers. But with no crime committed, what ground did he have to investigate? The Caldwells didn't ask for protection, only remarked quietly on the unease they felt. And so the sheriff reassured them, promised to keep an eye on travelers. That promise, in hindsight, would forever feel hollow. Late on the night of October 28th, one of the Caldwell children, Eleanor, mentioned to her mother that she had seen the tall woman again at the edge of the field. Margaret pressed for more, but Eleanor grew frightened, refusing to say whether the woman had spoken or moved. She simply said she stood there, in silence, staring. That description, the tall woman, would take on haunting significance after the family's vanishing. Because, as records and witness interviews later revealed, Eleanor was not the only child who used those words. Other children from nearby farms described the same mysterious female figure, always taller than most, always standing in silence, never stepping into the lamplight. It was the kind of detail that made adults shudder, not only because of the image itself, but because of the consistency with which children, who had no chance to share stories, described her. Looking back on those weeks before the Caldwell family disappeared, these seemingly disconnected accounts painted a portrait of dread no one at the time could fully see. Strangers in the night, footsteps in the mud, laughter that carried without source. A woman too tall, too silent, always present. On October 30th, 1920, the Caldwells attended Sunday church service as usual. Neighbors greeted them warmly, though some couldn't help but exchange cautious glances. Henry seemed worn in the face, Margaret distracted. As they left, little Sarah clung tightly to her mother's skirt, unwilling to play with other children outside. No one could have guessed that this was the last time the Caldwell family would be seen alive. What followed, in the hours after, would become one of Tennessee's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. And it all began with the strange visitors that witnesses swore they saw before the Caldwells vanished. The evening of October 30th passed much like any other in that quiet Tennessee valley. The sun dipped behind the hills, leaving streaks of orange, fading into indigo. The Caldwell farmhouse sat in its familiar solitude, lantern light glowing faintly from its windows as Margaret prepared supper. Neighbors who passed along the road later recalled the smell of firewood drifting from the chimney, a sign that the Caldwells were tucked safely inside. But as simple as that evening seemed, witnesses would later remember subtle things, details that in hindsight carried the unease of foreshadowing. That night, Marcus Webb, the Caldwells' nearest neighbor, swore he saw someone standing in the farthest corner of the field as he walked home with his lantern. At first, he thought it was Henry, but the figure was too still, too upright, its outline sharp against the dying light. When Marcus raised his lantern, the figure seemed to turn, though he could not see its face. It disappeared into the tree line without a word. Shaken, Marcus hurried along the road, convincing himself it was a trick of dusk, perhaps even a scarecrow that had caught his eye. But in later years, he never faltered when he recounted what he saw. There had been someone there, watching. Inside the farmhouse, Henry spoke little at supper. The children picked at their food, while Margaret did her best to maintain normalcy. Tension crackled in the air, though no immediate reason for it could be found. In her later written statements, Margaret's sister, who had visited frequently, would claim that Margaret had become increasingly anxious in the previous week, as though expecting something she could not name. The sound of distant footsteps or the creak of a branch outside the bedroom window became constant torment for her. After supper, Henry tended to the barn. The horses, he'd remarked, had grown restless at night. He found them pawing the ground, ears twitching at something unseen in the dark. On this particular night, they stamped and snorted when he entered, their unease so unusual that Henry lingered, stroking their necks until they calmed. He would not return to the house until nearly an hour later. By then, the children were asleep. Margaret sat sewing near the fire, though her needle trembled in her hands. She asked Henry if he had seen anyone on the property. He said no, and reminded her that they weren't about to live in fear of shadows. But even he admitted to her, quietly, almost reluctantly, that he thought someone had been walking along the ridge lately. Neither pushed the conversation further. They went to bed in silence. Sometime between midnight and dawn, the world surrounding the Caldwell house seemed to shift. No neighbors saw the strangers, at least not directly. But those who lived nearest the Caldwells later reported hearing something unusual. Dogs in the valley barked without pattern, howling toward the woods as if chasing something they could not reach. A farmer 2 roads away claimed he woke suddenly to the sound of a horse galloping down the dirt road. When he stepped out with his lantern, nothing was there. And Marcus Webb, restless and unable to sleep, remembered hearing laughter, a woman's voice, light but not joyful. It carried across the fields and was gone as quickly as it came. By sunrise the next morning, October 31st, the Caldwell farmhouse stood strangely still. Neighbors who expected to see Henry in the fields working early found the land untouched. The animals remained unfed, the horses quiet though alert. The chimney gave no smoke. Within hours, Marcus approached out of concern, calling Henry's name at the gate. No answer came. He walked closer, noting the unusual quiet. The curtains inside were drawn, blocking his view. He knocked on the door. Silence. After waiting in growing unease, Marcus stepped around to the side of the house. What he found unsettled him instantly. Near the well, pressed into the damp earth, were footprints. Too many and too varied to make sense. He described them later as smaller than Henry's boots, larger than Margaret's shoes, as though several people had been walking there during the night. Some prints overlapped, twisting in strange arcs that did not resemble natural pacing. Among them, he swore, were bare footprints, human but without shoes. And the strangest detail, some appeared oddly elongated, as if whoever left them did not step quite as ordinary people would. Panicked now, Marcus rushed back and gathered others. Together, neighbors entered the house. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. The supper dishes remained neatly stacked from the previous night, the children's shoes placed by the hearth as they always were. The beds looked as though they had been slept in, but no family members were anywhere inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken windows. The Caldwells had simply vanished. The sheriff was called without delay. He examined the house carefully, outwardly calm, though witnesses noticed how his jaw tightened at what he saw. He could not explain the footprints. He could not explain why a family of 5 would leave their home in the middle of the night without horses, without wagon, without coats, even as the October air turned cold. He ordered the fields and roads searched. Men combed the woods, calling the Caldwells names for hours. Not a trace emerged. As the day wore on, more strange reports came forward. A woman living on the far side of town remembered seeing 2 figures walking at dawn along the old creek road. She thought little of it at the time, but when news of the disappearance spread, she swore they moved in silence, keeping their heads low, as though carrying something between them. Others admitted hearing odd noises at night for weeks, but none had believed them significant until now. For days, the search widened. Posses of local men rode into the hills, following deer paths and creek beds. Word spread to nearby counties. By the end of the week, deputies from Nashville arrived. Newspapers began to cover the disappearance, their headlines cloaked in the hushed drama of mystery. Family vanishes without trace in Tennessee hills. Yet despite the attention, no answers came. The Caldwells were simply gone. Witnesses returned again and again to their stories of the strangers. Every account seemed to center on them. The tall woman, the pale faces on the road, the laughter in the distance. But whenever new details emerged, they felt maddeningly incomplete. Some swore 2 strangers had been seen. Others insisted there were 3. Some said their clothing was dark, another remembered light coats. No description ever stayed consistent, except for one fact. Whoever these visitors were, they did not belong, and they seemed to vanish the moment anyone gave them attention. The sheriff fought with the evidence. No ransom note, no robbery, nothing stolen. The animals and house remained untouched. The family simply stepped from their lives into another world of silence. Investigators scoured the well, the barn, the fields. No bodies, no personal items discarded, no trail. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole. In the weeks to come, neighbors avoided the Caldwell property. Fields went untended, the quiet farmhouse becoming a shell, its windows staring blankly across the empty land. A few brave souls claimed to see movement near the woods on moonlit nights, figures shifting where the trees began. But when lanterns or rifles were carried closer, there was nothing. The mystery hardened, lingering over the valley. The Caldwell disappearance became not just a story, but a warning. And at the center of it all, burned into local memory, was the question no one could answer. Who were the strange visitors? What did they want from a Caldwells? And why did they vanish as completely as the family they preceded? In the days that followed the disappearance, the quiet town of Greene County, Tennessee, found itself at the center of an unsettling storm. The Caldwell case was unlike any the sheriff's office had ever encountered. Missing cattle, runaway hands, disputes over property. These were the normal rhythm of rural law enforcement. But an entire family, father, mother, and 3 young children, gone without a trace? That was something altogether different. The sheriff, William Porter, was a man known for his composure and sharp instinct. Yet, when he stepped inside the Caldwell farmhouse on the first morning of the investigation, he admitted privately that something about it felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. Too orderly. Too untouched. When people leave in haste, houses tell the story. A meal left scattered, a chair knocked from its place, a lamp knocked over. But here, there was none of that. The Caldwells had gone to bed, and then vanished. The house held on to their absence like a silent accusation. On the second day of the investigation, Porter assembled the neighbors one by one. He questioned Marcus Webb about the footprints near the well. Marcus was firm in his account. There had been too many prints, too fresh, to belong solely to Henry or the children. Some were bare, some oddly spaced. Porter jotted the description and said little, though Marcus later recalled noticing how tightly the sheriff gripped his pencil. Margaret's sister, Ruth McAllister, was interrogated next. She wept openly, recounting how Margaret had complained of strangers on the property. When pressed for what kind of strangers, Ruth repeated what her niece Eleanor had said only days earlier, the image of a tall woman on the edge of the field. Porter asked if Margaret had ever described her. Ruth shook her head, saying only that her sister had become paranoid of late and unusually protective of her children. The word soon spread beyond Greene County. Reporters from Knoxville and Nashville made their way into town, their presence both welcomed and resented. They promised to bring wider attention to the case, but their questioning often felt invasive, poking into family histories and community secrets. The Caldwell home, once a place of laughter and labor, became a spectacle. Curiosity seekers visited, staring at the silent walls as though expecting a clue to appear in the windows. As the investigation grew, locals were asked to provide testimonies of any odd occurrences in the weeks prior. It was then that a pattern began to emerge. One farmer, Elias Johnson, told of seeing 2 figures standing at the crossroads late at night, not moving, simply staring into the distance. He assumed they were wayfarers, until he noticed that when his lantern light approached, they melted into the darkness as though swallowed by it. Another neighbor swore he heard footsteps pacing outside his kitchen one night, though no one was there when he checked. The dogs barked furiously, something they rarely did. The salesman who had passed near the Caldwell land once more repeated his tale. Pale faces, a momentary glimpse of 2 strangers, then nothing. His wagon horses bolting into terror. As Sheriff Porter compiled these statements, he grew restless. Too many versions. Too much vagueness. Nothing that could stand up as evidence. And yet, the consistency of certain elements, 2 figures, sometimes joined by a third, clothing unfamiliar, the silence they carried with them, pulled the entire account together like threads weaving a strange fabric. Still, the law needed more than whispers and shadows. Porter organized a search party to scour the woods. For days, men lined up shoulder to shoulder along the ridges, calling out the names of Henry, Margaret, Eleanor, James, and Sarah. With each unanswered call, dread carved deeper into the valley. On November 6th, a team of searchers made a discovery down by the creek that set the whole town's nerves aflame. In the soft mud, 4 sets of footprints trailed together. 3 smaller ones, side by side, always bracketed by 2 larger. They followed the bend of the creek until they vanished abruptly at the water's edge. There were no prints on the opposite bank. It was as if those who walked had simply stepped into the current and ceased to exist. Porter photographed the prints. But 1920 was no age for forensic miracles. He could only record them, not explain them. To some, this was evidence enough, proof that strangers had indeed led the Caldwell children away. But the absence of Henry and Margaret's adult tracks haunted the sheriff. Why were the children's footprints there, but not the parents'? When reporters caught hold of the story, headlines grew bold. The Knoxville Herald ran with "Family lured into woods by wandering strangers." Another paper called it "The Phantom Visitors of Greene County." What began as a missing persons case was transforming into a tale of fear, gossip, and something darker. Something people dared not name directly. The townsfolk reacted accordingly. Doors were locked earlier at night. Lanterns set burning longer until morning. Men walked armed on the road, glancing over their shoulders when the trees rustled. Mothers forbade their children from wandering the fields after dusk. And through it all, the question grew louder. Who were these strangers? Travelers? Criminals? Or something else entirely? On November 10th, the sheriff held a town meeting at the church. The pews overflowed. He announced that despite best efforts, no evidence of the Caldwell family had been found. Volunteers were still needed for searches, but some men had begun to weary, returning each day without progress. Porter reassured them he would not rest until answers were found. Yet his words could not mask the undercurrent of unease. After the meeting, an elderly woman stood at the rear of the congregation and whispered aloud the thought that many had kept locked inside. They weren't strangers. They were waiting. Her words spread faster than any command the sheriff gave. Waiting for what? For the Caldwells themselves? For something yet to come? The memory of the tall woman, especially, unnerved the town. Children had no business inventing such tales in consistency. How had Eleanor described her with the same unease that others now began to echo? Parents questioned their own sons and daughters. Some answered with silence, but others admitted they, too, had glimpsed her. Always by the edge of fields. Always standing still. Always watching. By Thanksgiving of 1920, the disappearance of the Caldwells had grown cold in terms of evidence. But in reality, the fire of speculation had only deepened. Families kept watch at night, ears alert for laughter that floated with no source. Some claimed to hear it near the churchyard. Others near the river crossing. A few swore, trembling, that they had even seen her, the tall woman, walking along the road when the moon was swollen above the hills. At his desk, Sheriff Porter hunched over his notes. He had grown tired, eyes ringed with sleepless nights. But he refused to abandon the case. In his private writings, discovered decades later, he confessed his frustration. Nothing here follows reason. These accounts of strangers appear as smoke. I can trace them, but never seize them. I fear the Caldwells may be lost for good. And yet the watchers remain. The townspeople tried to carry on, but they failed. The Caldwell farm remained empty and soon grew overgrown. The absence itself became a presence, a hollow space in the landscape that seemed to whisper its own warning. And so, what began as an investigation gradually transformed into something else, a legend. For the strange visitors were not only remembered, they were seen again. Too many times, by too many people, to be dismissed completely. What bound those stories together, however, was not just the sightings themselves, but the feeling that followed them. That unshakable sense that the strangers were never gone. That they were patient. That they were waiting still. By the first winter after the Caldwells' disappearance, the search efforts had slowed. Snow dusted the fields, covering whatever faint traces might have remained. Sheriff William Porter still drove himself into the case, refusing to let it fade into another unsolved mystery. But as weeks passed with no breakthrough, the townsfolk began to tell different kinds of stories. Stories that would grow beyond the limits of official reports and creep into the very marrow of Greene County's lore. Rumors spread first in quiet whispers, usually after church services, when the congregation drifted outside into the chilled air. One mother would lean close to another and admit that her child had woken in tears, swearing they saw the tall woman by the window during the night. Men returning from late wagon trips confided to one another of seeing silhouettes standing at crossroads, unmoving, as if waiting for someone to come to them. Such accounts multiplied, feeding on both fear and imagination. The town was no stranger to superstition. Like many rural parts of Tennessee in 1920, families passed down cautionary tales meant to keep children close to home after dark. But this felt different. These stories weren't vague fables about spirits or old wives' tales. They were tied to people everyone had known personally. The Caldwells were not strangers from another place. They were neighbors, friends, kin. And now they were missing without answer. Sheriff Porter tried to tamp down the mounting hysteria. He urged citizens to focus on facts, to report only what could be verified. But for many, facts had grown hollow. Every night that the farmhouse stood silent was another night the imagination filled the void. On December 3rd, a young boy named Thomas Grady claimed to have seen Eleanor Caldwell by the creek. He described her plainly to his mother, wearing the same dress she'd worn the week before she vanished. His mother dismissed it as a dream, but when Thomas repeated the account to his teacher the next morning, his voice shaking, his eyes unwavering, it spread like wildfire. In town, some began to wonder, had the family died at all? Or were they taken somewhere else? People did not speak openly of what else might mean, but the weight of it settled over them like the frost. Then came the report that unsettled even the level-headed sheriff. On a clear night in mid-December, two farmers, traveling separately, both reported seeing three figures walking side by side down Hollow Ridge Road. They were described as tall, their pace unnatural, their steps silent against the dirt. Both farmers insisted the figures were heading in the direction of the Caldwell farm. Neither man dared follow them. Instead, both urged their horses to move faster until home fires were in sight. When Porter heard both accounts, so consistent, so eerily alike, he rode to the farmhouse that night with two deputies. They searched every corner by lantern, finding only snow pressed smooth against the earth. No footprints, no trespassers. And yet, all three men later admitted they could not shake the feeling of being watched while they stood on that property, as if eyes drifted just beyond the circle of lamplight. It was around that time that the phrase "the visitors" began to take permanent hold among townsfolk. They were no longer just mysterious travelers or possible criminals. They had become something else, the strange visitors who watched, waited, and walked quietly where no answers could be found. The newspapers pressed harder. One article in the Nashville Daily American carried the headline, "Phantom Strangers Haunt Site of Vanished Family." Perhaps it was meant to sell more papers, but the words embedded themselves into the public imagination. Locals bristled at the implication of phantoms. This was not a ghost tale, after all, but the description of visitors, silent and persistent, felt uncomfortably close to truth. Meanwhile, Sheriff Porter attempted to operate a line between investigation and rumor. He wrote letters to state officials in Nashville, hoping for assistance from more experienced authorities. He even considered petitioning federal attention. But the Caldwells' disappearance lacked the kind of provable crime that higher offices demanded. Without a body, without evidence of foul play, his pleas sounded desperate. By late December, the file on Henry, Margaret, Eleanor, James, and Sarah Caldwell was thick with contradictory testimony. Witnesses disagreed, timelines blurred, but at the center stood one undeniable pattern. Too many had seen the strangers to ignore them. One night, just after Christmas, something new added weight to that pattern. A pair of hunters, traveling back from the hills, passed near the Caldwell acreage just after sundown. They later told the sheriff that lanterns glowed faintly near the barn, as though someone had lit them inside. One of the hunters, bold enough to approach, swore he saw figures moving just beyond the broken wooden slats. But as they came closer, the lanterns flickered and vanished. When they stepped into the barn, nothing and no one remained. This account reached the town within hours. It was no longer just strangers glimpsed on lonely roads. Now it was as though the visitors had taken occupancy of the very land itself, their presence tied inextricably to the family that was gone. The farm that once represented life, harvest, and community now pulsed in the townsfolk's imagination as a place of fear. By January, few dared walk past it after dark. The stories traveled outward, too. From Greene County into surrounding hills, farmers traded rumors at markets. Travelers carried them further, until eventually, the Caldwell case became not just local news, but a regional legend. Among the most chilling came from a merchant staying in Greenville, the nearest town. Returning late to his rented boarding room one night, he claimed that, turning a corner, he nearly collided with a woman taller than he had ever seen. Her face, he said, was blank, not expressionless, but indistinct, pale like paper in the moonlight. When he gasped and stumbled back, she walked past without acknowledgement, her silence making the encounter worse than any cry or shout could. The merchant's story drew sneers from skeptics, but it aligned too closely with past accounts to be ignored. Again, the description of a tall woman was whispered, always there, always still, always moving just where light dared not reach. Sheriff Porter filed the merchant's statement dutifully, but privately. His notes betrayed his frustration. "I am left chasing shadows." If these visitors are real, they evade with unnatural skill. If they are not, then why do so many claim to see the same thing? By early January, Greene County was 2 months deep into a mystery that refused to loosen its hold. The Caldwells were still missing, and what remained was a growing sense among the people that they might never return, not because they were dead, but because something or someone had taken them away with purpose. That thought, unspoken but omnipresent, reshaped daily life in the community. Farmers no longer trusted the once familiar woods. Families shortened their trips into town. And when children woke crying in the night, whispering of shapes at the window, few parents had the courage to dismiss them out of hand. The investigation was not closed, but it was slipping from the realm of law into legend. And in that shift, fear deepened. For if no law could stop these visitors, what power did ordinary people have at all? By January of 1921, Greene County was no longer the quiet farming community it had once been. The disappearance of the Caldwell family had not only unsettled people, it had divided them. Fear is not a silent guest. It demands expression, and when left unanswered, it turns neighbor against neighbor, searching desperately for someone, anyone, to blame. In the weeks after Christmas, whispers passed through the town with growing sharpness. Some accused outsiders, wandering drifters, traveling salesmen, or the occasional migrant workers who passed through after the cotton harvest. Others, more quietly, wondered if the truth lay disturbingly close to home. Could someone among them have played a role in the family's vanishing? The first cracks showed in church. One Sunday morning, as hymns rose haltingly from the pews, murmurs disturbed the stillness. A deacon's wife accused the Johnson boys of lying about what they'd seen near Hollow Ridge Road. She claimed they invented stories of the 3 silent figures for attention. Their mother shot back with fury, swearing on scripture that her sons told the truth. Voices rose, and the sermon itself drowned beneath the clash of suspicion. Reverend Clark, his eyes weary above his Bible, scarcely managed to restore calm. At the general store, similar disputes flared. Some insisted that the strange visitors were surely real, seen by too many to dismiss. Others scoffed, demanding, "If these strangers exist, why has nobody caught them? Why no proof, no capture, no trail?" The debates rarely ended with agreement, only more resentment. Sheriff Porter stood in the middle of these tensions, struggling to balance his duties. He had grown exhausted, both by relentless questions and by the growing gap between what the law could answer and what the community wanted to hear. He still gathered evidence, still pressed for leads, but the trail was fading colder, and people's patience was wearing thin. One bitter evening, in the first week of January, a town meeting was called in the Grange Hall. The sheriff spoke plainly. Without new evidence, without fresh testimony, the formal investigation would eventually stall. He urged the community to remain calm and to trust one another as they had for generations. But his words failed to soothe. Instead, men stood one by one, voicing frustrations. One accused Porter of neglect, saying the search parties should have dug deeper into the hills. Another, fists clenched, shouted that Porter was blind for dismissing the idea that the Caldwells had been taken by those strange visitors. When asked directly what taken meant, the man fell silent. Nobody wished to say aloud the full weight of what they feared. The meeting ended in chaos, voices colliding until Reverend Clark prayed loudly over the clamor. But when people finally spilled into the cold night, their divisions felt sharper than ever. In the weeks that followed, the divisions turned personal. Some families barred their doors to neighbors they had once welcomed warmly. Old grievances resurfaced, fueled by paranoia. Arguments over property lines, debts unpaid, or grudges long buried. Now, under the shadow of the Caldwell mystery, such tensions found new strength. It was during this time that several strange incidents occurred, incidents that only worsened the air of mistrust. The Webb family, closest in distance to the Caldwells, reported hearing movement near their barn at night. Marcus Webb swore he saw light flicker between the slats, though when he entered, it was dark and empty. Days later, one of his milk cows was found dead, throat gashed by what looked like a blade. Neighbors whispered this was a warning, or worse, that Marcus himself staged it to draw attention. Marcus erupted with anger at the accusation. Old friendships began to fray. Elsewhere in late January, the Grady child who once claimed to see Eleanor Caldwell by the creek fell terribly ill. Fever consumed him. In his delirium, he repeated the same phrase, "She's calling me from the edge." His mother wept beside the bed as neighbors exchanged horrified glances. When the boy recovered weeks later, he remembered nothing. But for his family, the terror lingered. Other children echoed unsettling claims. In hushed voices, parents reported their sons and daughters waking in the night, pointing at the wrong corners of their rooms, whispering of figures standing outside the glass. The consistency of these stories from different households shook the community deeper. Parents who might once have dismissed such talk as simple nightmares no longer dared. Too many children, too many similar words. The sheriff struggled to keep this under control. He pleaded with townsfolk to stop spreading fantastical claims. But even as he spoke, a part of him began to falter. Privately, he admitted in his notes that he had begun locking his own door for the first time in his life. And more troubling, he too thought he glimpsed movement in the shadows on long rides home. A figure at the tree lean, vanishing whenever his lantern turned its beam. He refused to confess this publicly, but the doubt gnawed at him. February brought heavy snow, muffling the sounds of the valley and blanketing the abandoned Caldwell farm in silence. And yet, people swore this silence was alive. Hunters who strayed too close to the land described hearing laughter ripple across the field. Thin, distant, female. They returned pale, refusing to hunt in that stretch again. With each new story, the legend of the strange visitors grew. But as it grew, so did the anger within the community. Many believed the sheriff had lost control, that the law was useless against whatever force was haunting them. Some argued they should take matters into their own hands, that armed watchmen should patrol the Caldwell acreage to catch whoever still stalked there. By the end of February, vigilantes formed loose patrols. Lanterns swayed across fields at night. Men with rifles stationed themselves along the road. Nothing came of it. They never caught the visitors. But they did find themselves staring at one another with deepening mistrust, half believing that the danger might not come from the woods at all, but from neighbors with something to hide. The Caldwell disappearance had begun as a tragedy, but now it was something more corrosive. It was a wound tearing the town apart, a fear that eroded trust, replacing it with suspicion, anger, and an isolation that crept from household to household. Sheriff Porter, in his weariness, recorded a line that would long outlive him. What haunts Greene County is not only the loss of the Caldwells, but the loss of faith. Our people no longer believe in each other. In that silence, something else has taken root. And so, through the cold winter months, Greene County lived not only with a mystery, but with a fracture. Families drew inward, neighbors grew wary, and the roads that once rang with laughter and shared labor became marked by silence. Yet beneath it all, one truth remained, whispered in kitchens, murmured across firelit porches. The visitors were still here. Not gone, not forgotten. Watching, waiting, moving along the ridges when the moon was full. The Caldwells were gone, but the visitors had not left. By early March of 1921, Greene County was no longer an isolated pocket of tragedy. News of the Caldwell disappearance, and more importantly, the strange visitors tied to it, had spread across Tennessee and further into the South. What had begun as frightened whispers among farmers had evolved into a story that newspapers painted with bold strokes, wrapped in mystery, shadow, and speculation. Trains into Knoxville carried men with notebooks and cameras, eager to capture what they believed could be a human interest story ripe for the sensational headlines of the new decade. Photographers knocked politely on farmhouse doors, aiming their bulky cameras at the worried faces of locals. Journalists scribbled in shorthand while gossip fed their columns. And inevitably, a steady stream of curious outsiders found reason to wander into Greene County. Skeptics chasing entertainment, thrill seekers hunting for a ghost story, investigators convinced they might be the ones to solve what the sheriff could not. The townsfolk bristled under the intrusion. For generations, Greene County had prided itself on its self-reliance and privacy. To have outsiders leaning over fences, asking about the tall woman or the footsteps in the fields, felt both humiliating and threatening. Worse still was the way reporters seemed eager to twist the story into something supernatural, something otherworldly. Words that caused tension to boil quickly in a community already fractured by fear. One headline from the Memphis Press read, "Strange forces at work in Tennessee Valley, family taken by nightly watchers." Another, from as far away as Atlanta, declared, "Children whisper of tall phantom woman before family vanishes." The fact that the stories now reached well beyond Tennessee only deepened the unease. Farmers, who once dismissed the whole episode as exaggerated rumor, now found themselves bombarded by letters from distant relatives. Is it true? Have you seen them? What are these visitors everyone speaks of? The notoriety haunted them. Sheriff Porter, still tied to his duty, reluctantly cooperated with the reporters in the early weeks. He gave interviews, though short and measured, relying only on confirmed details. He avoided all mentions of phantom visitors. "There is a family missing," he would repeat. "We seek answers grounded in fact and evidence." Nothing more. But the reporters were not satisfied with facts. They pressed about the footprints by the well, the laughter heard at night, the uniform consistency of children describing the tall woman. Porter bristled, sometimes storming out of conversations when journalists pressed too hard. Townsfolk fared worse. Farmers, who had spoken once or twice of strange encounters, now found themselves quoted in lurid headlines. Subtle descriptions became exaggerated. A glimpse of a woman became a specter stalking by moonlight. Footsteps near a farm became phantom processions through the countryside. The exaggeration made some furious, while others, quietly, admitted to themselves that perhaps the newspapers hadn't stretched things too far after all. The presence of outsiders created new friction. On more than one occasion, locals caught thrill seekers trespassing onto the Caldwell farm at night, hoping to glimpse the infamous visitors. Lanterns moving through the abandoned farmhouse drew scorn and anger. Some men had to be chased out with rifles raised, though none were fired. For locals who already avoided the property, the mockery of outsiders treating their fear as spectacle cut deep. By mid-March, the distrust between townsfolk and outsiders became nearly as charged as the tension over the mystery itself. It showed vividly one evening when a gathering was held at the Grange Hall. A handful of reporters had been invited, hoping the sheriff would give fresh news. What they got instead was a quarrel. Marcus Webb rose from his chair, his voice loud with anger, declaring that the visitors were real, that he had seen them plain as day. A reporter smirked, scoffing that maybe Marcus mistook shadows for ghosts. The laughter of other outsiders filled the room. Neighbors who had stood by Marcus turned red with outrage. Suddenly the issue at hand wasn't about the Caldwells, but about dignity, about belief, and the lines between those who lived in Greene County and those who did not. The sheriff struggled that night to contain the anger, but the damage was done. Outsiders were no longer welcome in Greene County, not even the ones who claimed they only wanted to help. Yet despite attempts to close their doors, more outsiders came. A professor from Vanderbilt arrived, claiming to study the psychology of the townsfolk, whether mass hysteria had overtaken them. His questions offended many, especially when he suggested the children's stories of the tall woman might merely be the product of suggestion spread between families. He did not stay long. Angry mutterings suggested he ought to leave well before nightfall. Then came a private investigator from St. Louis, a man named Franklin Price. He arrived with a notebook, a revolver on his hip, and the conviction that the truth lay in human hands, not shadows. He interviewed neighbors with almost military precision, tracing their accounts step by step. For a week, he camped near the Caldwell property with nothing but his lantern and rifle. His boldness earned him a grudging respect, though whispers spread that it was foolish. On his last night at the Caldwell farm, Price was heard firing his revolver twice. By morning, he packed his belongings quickly and boarded a train out of Greene County. When pressed, he denied having seen anything unusual. But the townsfolk noticed how pale he looked and how tightly his hands shook as he lit his final cigar before leaving. He never spoke of Greene County again. Stories of his shots fired carried their own weight. Some claimed he had seen the visitors, perhaps even driven them back. Others believed he fired in panic at shadows. The truth was never known. By April, Greene County's patience with outsiders snapped altogether. A wagon of traveling journalists was turned away from the road by armed locals. The Caldwell farmhouse, once abandoned in wary silence, now bore crude signs nailed to trees. Keep out. But the visitors, according to many, were not thwarted. Reports of sightings did not stop. They multiplied. Now, it was not only townsfolk who whispered of the tall woman and her silent companions. A pair of men from Chattanooga, curious thrill-seekers lured by news stories, claimed to see her walking by the creek late at night while they camped. Terrified, they left Greene County at dawn, spreading their tale across taverns in towns they passed through. What had once been a local mystery now blossomed into something larger, something resembling legend. Outsiders carried it with them like wind scattering embers, and everywhere it went, the story grew. Greene County groaned beneath the weight of its newfound notoriety. Its people wanted nothing more than peace, and yet peace remained impossible. For within the town, where the story had first taken root, the absence of the Caldwells continued to gnaw. None more so than Sheriff William Porter, who now spent late nights poring over his notes at his desk. The townsfolk could close their doors, could drive outsiders away, but the sheriff could not. Every night, the unanswered questions returned. Who were the strange visitors? What did they want? And why had they chosen the Caldwells? To him, it no longer mattered whether outsiders scoffed or outsiders believed. The fear of Greene County was not bound to rumor anymore. It lived in the silent fields, in the empty farmhouse, in every step that echoed at night when no one was seen. And Porter knew something with growing certainty. Whatever had taken the Caldwells was not gone. By May of 1921, Greene County had reached a breaking point. Months had passed since the Caldwell family's disappearance. The winter had come and gone. Spring had arrived with green fields and blooming dogwoods. Yet the air of dread still clung to the valley like morning fog. With every new season, people expected the fear to fade, the memory of the missing family to soften. But it did not. If anything, it grew sharper, heavier, more suffocating. Children no longer ran freely across open fields. Doors stayed barred after dusk. Lanterns burned late into the night. And the Caldwell farmhouse, left exactly as it had been the day the family disappeared, stood like a wound in the land. Its windows watched the road with dull, empty stares. Some swore that even in daylight, they could feel unease rolling off the land like heat waves. For the sheriff, William Porter, each passing day was another reminder of failure. His notes stacked higher. His sleepless nights grew longer. He had interviewed every witness, examined every hollow in the woods, questioned strangers and neighbors alike. Nothing broke open the truth. Behind closed doors, Porter confessed to his wife that he had begun to see things himself. Shapes in fields at twilight, still figures at the edge of his vision when he rode along the ridge. He tried to dismiss them as tricks of light, But what unsettled him most was how similar they were to the accounts others had given before him. The town, however, had grown tired of waiting for law and order. By early May, the community split into two factions. One side still trusted the sheriff, believing answers might yet come with more patience. The other side, far larger and louder, declared that action was needed, that they could no longer sit idle while strangers, visitors, or whatever they were, prowled their land unchecked. The breaking point came after a young girl, barely 9 years old, vanished for nearly 4 hours one Saturday evening. Her family found her wandering near the woods behind her home, dazed, her dress torn by brambles. When asked what had happened, her only answer chilled everyone. They wanted me to come with them. She could not, or would not, say who they were. Though the girl was returned safely, the story galvanized neighbors. That very week, men gathered at the Grange Hall, rifles resting at their feet, lanterns in hand. They spoke in hard voices, fueled by fear pushed into anger. If outsiders would not believe them, if the sheriff could not protect them, then they themselves would hunt the visitors, catch them, expose them, or drive them away forever. The sheriff attended, standing at the back of the hall as the discussion roared. He saw in their eyes not just fear, but fury, the desperation of people tired of shadows. Porter tried to argue. Rash actions could make matters worse, he warned. But his words were drowned beneath shouts. The people no longer trusted silence. They wanted confrontation. And so, late one Saturday evening in May, a band of 12 men set out toward the Caldwell property. Lanterns glowed in the dark, rifles gleamed in their grip. They marched with a determination that should have comforted them. But instead, tension hung in the air with every step. Even in groups, beneath moonlight, the woods along Hollow Ridge Road seemed alive with unseen eyes. Among them was Marcus Webb, who had been one of the first to see the strange figures months earlier. He walked at the front, his jaw tight, his heart pounding. Behind him, others muttered nervous prayers, though none admitted fear openly. When they reached the Caldwell farm, the night was uncannily still. The grass whispered faintly underfoot, the air heavy and damp. The house loomed in front of them, black and silent, its windows empty hollows. They fanned out across the property, searching near the barn, the creek, the fields where footprints had once been found. And then one man swore he saw movement, a figure tall, drifting along the edge of the field, halfway swallowed by moonlit mist. Strong hands clutched rifles tighter. Someone whispered, "There." The men advanced as one, rifles raised, lanterns spilling shaky circles of light across the grass. The figure seemed to pause, turn slightly, as though meeting their stare. It did not move closer nor further, just stood, watching. Marcus Webb shouted, ordering whoever it was to show themselves. No answer. Another man fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked through the night, echoing off the hills. But the figure did not flinch. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. Vanished. Shouts broke across the men, each swearing they'd seen it, each arguing whether to chase into the woods. Marcus ordered them to hold position. Running blindly into the treeline was suicide. The group searched until dawn, but no sign of the figure, nor any trace of footprints, remained. When they returned to town, the story spread instantly. Some praised them for their bravery, for proving that the visitors were real. Others condemned them, furious that they had fired weapons so close to the property, fearing this would bring even worse consequences. But whether praised or condemned, one thing was clear. Greene County had crossed a line. The fear was no longer quiet. It was armed. It was ready to act. For Sheriff Porter, this development was more frightening than any ghost story. He knew panic and guns made a volatile mix. Yet even as he wrote his reports, even as he begged for patience, he realized a bitter truth. Deep down, he too wanted answers. He could not dismiss what they had seen. His own eyes, in recent weeks, had caught fleeting figures by moonlight. He had woken in his home to faint laughter outside, a sound that should have been impossible. He was supposed to protect the town, but the thought dug at his mind, day after day. Protect them from what? By June, the community was a tinderbox. armed men patrolled the roads at night in pairs, watching fields, daring the visitors to appear again. Women clutched crosses near their throats when the sun sank low. Children slept in their parents' rooms, windows shuttered, lamps burning. Still, the visitors came. Or so they swore. Shadows standing still in fields. Silent figures along ridgelines, too tall, too motionless to be ordinary travelers. Laughter carried by spring winds. And sometimes, late at night, knocks on windows that vanished when curtains were pulled back. The Caldwell family had been gone for 7 months. But their absence had left more than grief. It left Greene County with an enemy they could not touch. And now, for the first time, the people themselves had chosen to fight back, though none could say what war they had just begun. Through the long nights of June, Sheriff William Porter began to feel the burden of the Caldwell case sinking into him like a shadow that would not leave. For 7 months, he had insisted on reason, on evidence, on law. He had brushed aside the whispers, the flickers of fear in his deputies' eyes, the dramatics of gossiping farmers. But with each passing week, it was his own resolve that weakened. He had not told anyone, not his deputies, not even his wife, that he too had started to see the visitors. Not clearly, not enough to swear on, but enough to unsettle him deeply. It began with footsteps. One night in late May, he woke abruptly, heart pounding, to the sound of gravel crunching outside his home. At first, he was sure it was a rider arriving unexpectedly. But when he stepped out with lantern in hand, the night was still. His yard, his porch, the dirt road, all lay in silence. Only the cicadas sang. He returned inside, shaken but stubborn. Perhaps some animal. Perhaps nothing at all. But then came a laughter. In early June, seated at his desk with notes spread across the lamplight, Porter froze as a faint, lilting chuckle floated through his open window. It was the laughter of a woman, or perhaps a child, he wasn't sure. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. He rushed outside, revolver drawn, but there was no one. No wind, no intruder. Just a stillness that pressed heavy, as though the night itself were holding its breath. He recorded it later in his private notebook, scribbling the same line twice. Heard it myself. This time I heard it myself. What disturbed him most was not the sound itself, but his own reaction. He, a man who had stood unflinching in courtrooms and broken up fistfights in saloons, now stood in his own yard with trembling hands. By mid-June, sleep became scarce. He began carrying his revolver even inside the house. When his wife noticed, she urged him to let the case go, to let the federal investigators take over if it weighed on him so heavily. "It's not your burden to carry alone," she whispered. But Porter shook his head. He couldn't let go. For him, the Caldwells were more than a case. They were a wound. And he was the one who had failed to close it. One evening, determined to face his unease directly, Porter rode alone to the Caldwell property. The farmhouse had become overgrown, weeds swallowing the fences, the barn leaning tiredly against the wind. He stood in the field as the sun slipped low, watching the horizon with a grim patience. If the visitors existed, if they had truly stalked this land, he wanted to see them with his own eyes. For nearly an hour, nothing stirred. The house creaked in the cooling air, an owl cried in the trees. Darkness thickened, and for a moment Porter felt foolish. Perhaps imagination had finally entangled him as it had the others. He nearly mounted his horse. And then he saw them, 3 shapes at the far edge of the field. No movement at first, just tall, still figures, black against the faint glow of dusk. His heart seized. He raised his lantern, squinting into the dark. The shapes did not vanish, did not flinch. They remained. One of them, the tallest, seemed to lean slightly forward. Porter's chest tightened. It was the woman. It had to be. The tall woman neighbors had described again and again. His first instinct was to draw his revolver. His second was to demand they identify themselves. But before words left his throat, the lantern sputtered, dimmed, and went out. Darkness swallowed the field. Panic surged, but Porter fumbled matches from his pocket, striking flame with shaking hands. When light bloomed again, the edge of the field was empty. Gone. All 3 figures erased. as though they had never been there at all. He felt terrorized, cold and wild, but also anger. He bellowed into the night, demanding they show themselves, demanding answers. Only his echo returned across the hollow land. When he finally mounted his horse to ride home, he realized his shirt was drenched in sweat despite the cool air. He gripped the reins with white-knuckled fists. For the first time since the October night when the Caldwells disappeared, he believed the witnesses. Every last one of them. From that night on, William Porter became a different man. He no longer dismissed the fears of Greene County. When children spoke of shapes at their windows, he listened carefully. When hunters claimed they had heard footsteps shadowing them, he recorded their words without skepticism. The sheriff, who had once anchored the town in logic, was changing. But this change came at a cost. Doubt gnawed at his core. He stopped attending Sunday service, unwilling to sit among whispers he could no longer quiet. His deputies noticed his unease, but none dared question him directly. When he spoke now, his words were quieter, his tone sharper, as though every exchange carried the weight of a warning. In his private notes, the language shifted. If the visitors can vanish at will, then catching them is impossible. They do not flee. They allow us to glimpse them. Why? The Caldwells are not coming back. Not by human means. The man who had once dismissed any notion of the supernatural now wrestled with the possibility of something beyond his reach. Not spirits, perhaps. Not demons. But something. Something watching them. Something patient. Something that wanted. By the first week of July, the town began to notice the sheriff's fraying edges. Some said his eyes darted more, scanning the horizon during conversations. Others whispered that he looked like a man who barely slept. Yet when Greene County seemed ready to give up altogether, Porter gathered resolve enough to make decision. If answers were to be found, they would be on the Caldwell property. That land was the epicenter, the wound, the place where all roads led. And so he declared quietly to his deputies one afternoon, "I'll return there. And I won't leave until I know what we're dealing with. Law demands answers. This town demands peace. And if the visitors are watching, they'll face me directly." But what he did not share, what his notes revealed years later, was the single truth he could no longer ignore. He was beginning to fear that Greene County wasn't dealing with strangers at all, but with something that belonged here, waiting long before the Caldwells ever vanished. On the evening of July 12, 1921, Sheriff William Porter saddled his horse and rode out alone toward the Caldwell farm. He did not tell his deputies where he was going. He did not notify his wife. To bring anyone else felt like a burden, or worse, a betrayal of the duty now pressing on him. If Greene County was to have answers, it would be by his own eyes, his own courage, and his own word. The farmhouse appeared as it always did, empty, weathered, a silent monument to the absence that gnawed at the valley for 9 long months. Porter tied his horse near the fence and walked slowly across the tall summer grass, revolver at one hip, lantern swinging in his grip. He felt the weight of a land pressing against him, heavier, somehow, than any place he had ever stood. Inside the house, it was as though time had frozen. Dust clung to the furniture, cobwebs filled corners, but the Caldwells' belongings remained untouched. The shoes by the hearth, the neat stack of plates, a child's small ribbon on the floor, dull with age but still pink. Porter stared at it for a long time, the lantern trembling slightly in his hand. It struck him that he was not just in a home. He was standing inside a wound. At sundown, Porter settled into the farmhouse's front room and prepared himself. He placed his notebook on the table, loading his revolver with deliberate care. He lit a second lantern, placing it by the window. Then he waited. The hours dragged in silence. Cicadas shrilled outside. Owls cried in the distance. The sheriff leaned back in the wooden chair, his hand resting lightly on the revolver's handle, his ears tuned to every faint sound. He expected boredom. Instead, he felt anticipation. His heart beat quicker as the night deepened, as if the darkness itself was thickening around him. Then, sometime after midnight, it began. The laughter. Faint at first, like a ripple carried on the wind. Porter froze. This was no trick of the mind. He knew the sound too well by now. Light, distant, feminine. He rose slowly, lantern in hand, peering through the window. The yard stood empty. Yet the laughter did not stop. It circled, drifting from one side of the house to another, as though the night itself were mocking him. He clenched his jaw, snatched the revolver from the table, and stormed out onto the porch. His voice cut against the silence. "Show yourselves. You will not haunt this land any longer." The laughter ceased. Porter's pulse thundered in his ears. He held the lantern high, scanning the edges of the field. Shadows stretched long from the trees, rippling faintly in the wind. Then he saw it. At the far ridge, 3 figures stood together. They were still a stone, taller than ordinary men, their outlines stark against the starlit sky. In the center towered the unmistakable silhouette of the woman, taller than either companion, her head tilting slightly as though studying him. Porter lifted the revolver. His hand shook despite years of steady aim. He shouted again, demanding they identify themselves. No reply. No movement. Just watching. Always watching. He took a step forward. Then another. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground resisted him. Within 50 yards, he raised the revolver, cocked it back, and fired a single shot. The sound cracked the night wide open. Birds scattered from the treetops. The smoke from the barrel curled into the air. Porter blinked through the recoil, lantern swinging wildly. When his eyes steadied, nothing. The figures were gone. He cursed under his breath, lowering the weapon, searching the grass for any shred of evidence. There were no footprints, no movement. Silence returned. Breathing hard, Porter stumbled back into the farmhouse. His jaw tensed, his chest aching with both fear and fury. He scrawled in his notebook with frantic strokes, saw them clearly this time. 3 figures. Tall woman in center. Fired. They vanished. For the next several hours, he sat trembling, forcing himself not to leave, not to abandon the vigil. The fear of mockery, if he returned empty-handed, weighed heavier than the fear of what he had seen. But the visitors were not finished with him. Around 3 in the morning, Porter heard a new sound within the farmhouse itself. Not laughter, not footsteps outside, but 3 crisp knocks on the wall, directly behind him, as though someone stood inches away on the other side. He spun, revolver raised, aiming at nothing but rotten wood. The knocking came again. Slow, deliberate. 3 beats, echoing through the hollow night. Porter's throat tightened. He backed toward the table, lantern flickering in his grip. Never once did he lower the gun. And then from upstairs came the sound of a child's voice. It was faint, muffled, as though calling from inside a room far away, but Porter heard it. "Mama?" His blood turned to ice. He wanted to shout, to demand the voice show itself, but his lips refused. He forced his boots up the staircase, one creaking step after another, until he reached the landing. The house lay silent, empty. He pushed open the children's bedroom door. The bed sat still, dust thick on the sheets. No one inside. And then, behind him, the laughter returned. Louder now. At the stairwell, blocking his way down. Porter clenched the revolver tighter than ever before. Sweat burned his eyes. He realized then something deep and terrible. He was not hunting answers anymore. He was prey. He did not remember leaving the farmhouse. Only that when dawn broke, he was back at the fence, horse saddled, watching the first light spill across the land. His revolver was down to 3 bullets. His hands trembled so badly he could not jot his usual notes. When he arrived back in town later that morning, the deputies were startled by his appearance. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He offered no statement, no details. He only muttered they were there, before retreating into his office and shutting the door. For the first time since the night of the Caldwell's vanishing, Sheriff Porter's authority faltered. Not because he had failed to act, but because his own eyes had betrayed him. He had seen the visitors for himself, shot at them, heard the child's voice upstairs. And now he could no longer deny what the town had believed all along. The law was helpless here. Whatever had taken the Caldwells, it was beyond law, beyond reason. And it was not leaving Greene County. By late July of 1921, 9 full months had passed since the Caldwell family vanished. Summer clung heavy over Greene County, the air soaked with heat, the nights thick with a buzz of cicadas. Yet the town lived not in warmth, but in a suffocating dread. Rumors of the strange visitors had become daily talk, woven into every conversation, no matter how ordinary. Children repeated stories in hushed voices, mothers whispered advice to ward off unseen threats, and men argued bitterly about what could be done. But Sheriff William Porter's vigil at the Caldwell farmhouse had changed everything. Though he did not say much publicly, word spread quickly that the sheriff himself had seen the visitors, fired shots, heard voices in the night. He had returned pale, drained, and different. That knowledge, that even their sheriff no longer denied the truth, sent ripples of both terror and resolve through Greene County. Something had to be done. The decision came at another packed meeting inside the Grange Hall. This time, Porter himself stood before the crowded room, lantern light burning across weary faces. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried weight enough to silence disputes. "I have seen them," he admitted, the statement cutting through like a blade. "Our neighbors were not wrong. The Caldwells were not taken by ordinary means. We cannot let fear undo us any longer. Whatever roams our land, whoever these visitors are, they come back again and again. And they will not stop unless we stand against them, together." For the first time in months, the room did not erupt in argument. There was only silence, heavy and sharp. Then, slowly, one man stood and said, "Then let's end it." It was agreed. Every able-bodied man would gather for a single night, armed and unified. They would surround the Caldwell property, close in, and confront the visitors once and for all. Not chase shadows, not scatter, but stand as one. The plan spread swiftly. Some women packed food and water for the vigil. Others prayed fiercely, tears brimming their eyes. Farmers readied rifles that had not been touched since the war. Boys too young to shoot begged to join. They were turned away. The town bristled with anxious preparation. On the evening of July 28th, nearly 36 men gathered on the road leading to the Caldwell farm. Lanterns glowed in the dusk, rifles and shotguns slung tight across shoulders. Sheriff Porter rode at their front, pale but steady, his revolver holstered at his side. He said little as they approached the farmhouse, only hold your ground. Whatever you see, do not run. We stand together. The men fanned across the property, forming a wide circle around the fields and barn. The farmhouse loomed in the center, black and silent as ever. For a time, the night was still. Cicadas droned, an owl cried, but no visitor came. Sweat dampened collars, knuckles whitened on gunstocks, nerves stretched taut. It was Marcus Webb who first whispered, "There." Heads turned toward the far ridge. And there they stood, 3 figures exactly as described, still, watching. The murmurs spread, tremors of fear breaking the line. But no one fled. Not this time. Lanterns thrust forward, rifles raised in a single trembling movement. The figures did not move. "Show yourselves," Porter shouted, his voice ringing across the field. No more stalking. No more terror. Step forward and be known. Silence weighed heavy. Then laughter. Thin, sharp, feminine. It rippled across the land, cutting through bone like cold steel. Men shifted uneasily, some aiming directly, fingers twitching. And then the figures began to walk. Not fast, not slow. A deliberate pace, one step at a time, from the ridge down toward the field. The lantern light caught them in fragments. Faces too pale, outlines too tall, movements too smooth to belong to ordinary travelers. The tall woman at the center tilted her head, studying the men as though amused. The unity of the group faltered. One younger farmer fired a shot, panic in his finger. The gun cracked, and the figures froze. Then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. Gasps and shouts rang out. Some swore the visitors had melted into the air. Others claimed they stepped backward into darkness, unnaturally quick. Rifles searched the fields, eyes darted frantically. "Hold the line. Porter commanded, "They're not finished." He was right. Moments later, laughter erupted again, but this time from every direction. It circled the men, threading through the darkness, high and low, distant and near. Figures appeared at different points along the field. 3, then 5, then 6, multiplying like shadows gathering form. Always still, always watching. Fear broke loose. Some men fired blindly, shots tearing into empty night. Others shouted prayers, gripping rifles so tightly their knuckles drained white. Lanterns swung wildly, circles of trembling light revealing only movement that slipped away the moment one tried to fix it. The chaos grew, but Porter, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at him to run, stood tall, revolver ringing out with each crack of gunfire. "Stand your ground," he roared. "Stand together." And then just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The laughter ceased. The figures vanished. The fields fell silent. Lantern light swayed nervously across grass and earth. The farmhouse loomed in its same old stillness. No bodies. No footprints. No trace. For long minutes, no one spoke. Then Marcus Webb whispered what they all were thinking. "They can't be fought." The men lowered their weapons, the weight of truth sinking into their shoulders. All their effort, all their resolve had led them here, and still, the visitors remained untouchable. By dawn, the failed vigil returned home, tired, broken, silent. Sheriff Porter alone lingered at the farm as the first light painted the sky. He stood on the porch, lantern burning low, staring across the fields that had become the heart of the county's wound. Slowly, he opened his notebook one last time and wrote, "We face them. They remain. They do not kill, they take. They do not flee, they watch. And they will keep watching. This is not an enemy we can defeat, only endure. The Caldwells are gone. The visitors are not. Greene County will never be free of them." These words were the last known entry in the sheriff's hand. In the weeks that followed, the town returned to uneasy quiet. The vigil was never repeated. Outsiders drifted away, their stories scattered like seeds across newspapers and taverns. Greene County closed in on itself, weary of answering questions that had no answers to give. The Caldwell farmhouse was eventually abandoned to ruin, its boards rotting under rain and sun. But even decades later, when the walls had collapsed and weeds consumed the land, locals still refused to walk past it after dusk. Children whispered of shapes on the ridge. Farmers swore of laughter drifting across fields at night. The legend endured not because of what could be proven, but because of what could never be denied. And so the strange visitors remained. Not ghosts, not thieves, not wanderers. Just watchers. Silent, patient, eternal. And in Greene County, Tennessee, they became part of the land itself, woven into every shadow, every story, every unquiet night. The Caldwell family never returned, but the visitors never left.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.